I paid $11 for a sheet of paper that said 2 Mescalero women belonged to a dead man's debt. Then I burned it. The money had been hidden beneath a rawhide patch on my saddle for 14 years. My father put it there before I left Missouri. He told me a man should keep one thing where greed could not find it. I thought he meant money. I was wrong. The year was 1878. I was 46 years old, broad enough in the shoulders to look stronger than I was, and tired enough in the eyes that most men did not ask me unnecessary questions. I hauled water barrels, flour, blasting powder, lamp oil, and mail between survey camps and mining settlements in southern New Mexico territory. It was honest work when the people hiring me were honest, and ordinary work when they were not. I owned 1 freight wagon, 2 dun mules named Bell and Copper, and a saddle mare with a white scar across her flank. The mare was called Mercy, although she had never shown any. I had also rebuilt an abandoned stage relay station beside a dry arroyo 2 days east of Mesilla. Rebuilt may be generous. There were 3 adobe rooms, a roof that leaked in 2 places, a stone corral, and a well that produced just enough water to keep a man from leaving. I called the place Dry Cedar. It was not a home then. It was where I stopped moving. There is a difference. I reached Pike's Station just after sunrise on the 3rd of April. I remember the date because I had a delivery ledger, and because some days burn their number into you. Orrin Pike ran the station under a government supply contract. He sold grain, coffee, tack, cartridges, cheap whiskey, and anything else a traveler might be ashamed to need. His front room smelled of mouse droppings, boiled leather, and the sweet rot of fruit packed too long in a crate. Pike was a narrow man with clean fingernails. I distrusted that immediately. A man running a desert freight stop should have dirt somewhere on him. I needed a new singletree bolt. Bell had cracked the old one on a rock shelf 5 miles west, and I had tied the rig together with chain and profanity. Pike had the bolt. He also had a line of 6 freight wagons waiting for him to decide what each driver could afford, so I waited. That was when I heard the tapping. Not pounding, not calling. 3 soft taps, a pause, then 2. I turned toward the back wall. There was a slatted door beside the grain bins, the kind used to keep animals out of a feed room. Through the gaps, I saw a woman's face. She was perhaps 40, sun-browned, hair braided close and tied with a strip of faded red cloth. Her expression was not pleading, it was measuring. Behind her stood a younger woman, 18 at most, with a bruise along one cheek and both hands wrapped around the handle of a broken broom. I asked Pike what was behind the door. He did not look up from his scale. "Contract labor," he said. "What kind?" "The kind that owes." He said the older woman's brother had taken flour, tools, and 2 blankets on credit from a mining camp store. The brother had died before settling the account. Pike had purchased the debt note from the storekeeper. The women were family, therefore the obligation had passed. That was the word he used, passed, as if debt were a fever. I asked where he was sending them. "Lake Valley," he said. "Laundry house, good arrangement. Better than the reservation. I had been to Lake Valley. Men went there to pull silver out of the ground and spend it faster than they found it." A laundry house near a mining camp could mean several things. None of them were good, I said. "Let me see the paper." Pike smiled. That smile told me he had already decided what kind of man I was, and what price that kind of man would pay. He brought out a folded note with a blue territorial seal pressed into the corner. The note named the dead brother. It listed $47 in supplies, $19 in carrying charges, and an additional custodial fee for the 2 women. At the bottom, in a different hand, someone had written that service by 2 female relatives would satisfy the account. The older woman watched me through the slats. The younger one did not. She watched the room, the windows, Pike's pistol, my hands. I asked, "What did you pay for this?" Pike leaned against the counter. "What is that to you? How much to take the note off your hands?" He looked at my boots, my coat, my wagon through the front window. He was inventorying me. 15. I have 11. You have more than 11. I have 11 for a lie written on paper. That is already generous. His smile disappeared. For a moment, I thought he would refuse because he enjoyed having power more than he enjoyed having money. Then the driver behind me coughed. Pike remembered he had an audience. He held out his hand. I went outside. My saddle was tied behind the wagon. The money lay beneath a rawhide repair on the left skirt, sewn there in 1864 and never touched. I cut the stitching with my pocket knife. The leather opened like an old wound. 11 silver dollars. Pike counted them twice. Then he signed the back of the note. I asked for the key. He said, "The paper is yours." They come with it. I said no, the lock comes with it. The room went still. Pike stared at me long enough to make sure I understood that he could turn the morning violent. I understood. I also understood there were 6 freight drivers in the room, and even cruel men prefer not to explain themselves before witnesses. He tossed me the key. I opened the slatted door. The older woman stepped out first. The younger came behind her with the broken broom handle still in both hands. I held up the note so they could see it. Neither spoke much English. I had enough Spanish to trade, and the older woman had enough to understand danger. "This paper says you owe him," I said. She looked at Pike, then at me. I carried the note to the iron stove. Pike said, "What are you doing?" I opened the door and pushed one corner into the coals. The blue seal curled first, then the names, then the numbers. The younger woman moved closer to the stove. She watched until the last black edge folded in on itself. Pike swore at me. I told him to write me a receipt for the $11. He laughed. I said, "You sold me a debt note in front of 6 men. Write the receipt." He wrote it. That receipt would matter later. At the time, I folded it once and put it in my shirt pocket because I did not yet understand how much of a man's life can depend on one ugly line of ink. Outside, the older woman asked where I expected them to go. I said I did not know. She asked why I had bought the note. "Because Pike was sending you somewhere you did not choose." "That is not an answer. It is the one I have." She studied me. The younger woman said something in Apache. The older woman translated. "She says men do not spend silver to gain nothing." I looked at the rawhide flap hanging loose from my saddle. She is right. The younger woman tightened her grip on the broom handle. I said, "I spent it to gain the right to watch that paper burn." The older woman translated. Neither of them believed me. That was sensibles. I told them there was an agency camp west of the river, Mescalero south, and Mescalero country north and east. I could take them as far as my route allowed. I also told them night would find us in open ground if we kept arguing in Pike's yard. The older woman said they would ride in the wagon until they decided otherwise. I said that was fair. Pike watched us leave from his doorway. I remember thinking he looked small. That was another thing I was wrong about. Small men can cast long shadows when they stand behind offices. For the first day we spoke only when water or food required it. The older woman sat near the back of the wagon with her shoulders against a flour sack. The younger one sat where she could see the road behind us. She kept the broken broom handle across her knees until noon. Then she threw it into the brush without comment. At camp, I gave them my bedroll and slept beneath the wagon. The ground was cold and Belle stepped on my blanket before dawn. I do not mention this to make myself noble. I mention it because good intentions are often uncomfortable in extremely ordinary ways. The next morning, the older woman told me the names they used in Spanish-speaking towns. She was Rosa. The younger woman was Inés, her brother's daughter. They had other names, their own names. I heard them over the years, but I will not put them here. Some things are not improved by being repeated badly by an old man. Rosa's brother had worked seasonally for a woodcutting crew near the agency. He had taken supplies from a store, yes, but not $47 worth. After he died in a wagon accident, the storekeeper presented the family with a debt. An agency clerk added stamps. Pike added carrying charges. By the time the paper reached his station, 2 human beings had been converted into a column of numbers. That was how the country did some of its ugliest work, not with chains in the road, with clean handwriting. On the second afternoon, Rosa asked what I wanted in return. I told her nothing. She gave me a look that made the words sound childish. So I tried again. "I want you to choose where you go. That is all I can offer. And after you continue choosing," Inés spoke from behind us. Her Spanish was rough but clear. "Until you dislike the choice." I turned on the wagon seat. "Then you will learn what I do when I dislike something." She met my eyes. "What do you do?" "Usually I complain. Sometimes I repair a roof." That surprised a laugh out of her. One short sound. It vanished quickly, but it had happened. By sunset the next day, the wind had turned hard from the east. Mescalero country was still several days away, and a dust wall was building along the horizon. I told them my station was close. They could shelter there, leave when the weather broke, and take whatever food they needed. Rosa asked whether anyone else lived there. "No, why, I am difficult company," Inés said. "That part I believe." Dry cedar looked worse through their eyes. One room had a packed earth floor, one had boards. The kitchen chimney smoked when the wind came from the south. The roof above the storeroom had a brown stain shaped like Texas. The well curb leaned. The corral gate had to be lifted before it would close. Rosa walked the property in silence. Inés went directly to Mercy. Mercy pinned her ears, showed teeth, and prepared to behave like herself. Inés stood just beyond the mare's reach and waited. 5 minutes later, Mercy lowered her head. 10 minutes later, Inés touched the white scar on her flank. That was the first miracle at Dry Cedar, though Inés would have objected to the word. She did not believe in miracles where skill would do. Rosa came back from the arroyo and pointed toward a line of saltgrass 50 yards below the well. "There is water under that bank," she said. I told her the well was uphill. She said, "The well is where someone dug. The water is where the land put it." That sentence became the shape of our life. I had spent 6 years forcing Dry Cedar to be the place I thought I had bought. Rosa spent one afternoon seeing the place that was actually there. The dust storm held for 3 days. On the first day, Rosa patched the chimney throat with clay and broken pottery. The smoke stopped backing into the kitchen. On the second, Inés reset the corral gate with a flat stone and a strip of rawhide. On the third, I found Rosa below the saltgrass cutting a narrow trench into the bank. I asked what she was doing. Looking? For water? For the reason the grass stays green. By noon, wet sand appeared. By evening, a thin line of water gathered against the stones. Not much. A cup every few minutes. But in that country, a cup every few minutes is a future. When the storm passed, I told them I could take them north. Rosa looked at the new seep. "We will stay until the water is finished." I did not understand what she meant. The water was not finished for 30 years. 3 weeks later, Calvin Sloan arrived with a constable and 2 agency riders. Sloan was the clerk whose name appeared beneath the blue seal on Pike's debt note. He wore a gray coat despite the heat and carried a leather document case under one arm. His beard was trimmed close enough to suggest he spent more time near mirrors than horses. He did not greet Rosa or Inés. He addressed me. "You are harboring 2 absent wards," I said. "They are not absent. They are standing 10 feet from you." He opened his case and produced a printed order. It said Rosa and Inés were to be returned to agency supervision pending assignment. That word again. Assignment? I asked who had authorized Pike to keep them behind a grain door. Sloan said Pike had provided temporary transport. I asked why temporary transport required a debt note. Sloan's eyes moved to Pike's receipt in my hand. I had already learned to keep it close. He asked where the original note was. "In the stove." "You destroyed federal property?" "No, I destroyed a private fraud with your name on it." The constable shifted his weight. He had not expected that answer. Sloan told me the women would come with him. Rosa stood beside the kitchen door. Inés stood near the corral with Mercy's lead rope in her hand. I said, "Not today." He looked almost pleased. Men like Sloan prefer resistance when they already have authority. It saves them the work of inventing insult. He said he would return with a district order. I said, "Bring one. Bring your ledgers, too." His expression changed slightly. That was the first time I knew the ledgers mattered, not what was in them, only that he did not want them mentioned. Sloan left without the women. For 6 weeks, nothing happened. That was worse than action. Rosa and Inés worked as if danger had a schedule and labor could outlast it. We widened the seep into a stone-lined gallery. The flow settled at nearly 60 gallons a day. I measured because freight men measure everything. 60 gallons did not make us rich. It made us possible. Rosa planted beans in a low patch I had dismissed as alkali dirt. Inés repaired harness, trained Mercy out of 3 bad habits and into 2 better ones, and found a black gelding running loose near the foothills. She returned after dark leading him with a rope made from twisted yucca fiber. I asked whether the horse belonged to anyone. She said he did not mention it. By June, we were selling water to passing cattle outfits and growing enough beans to stop buying them in Mescalero. Rosa insisted on keeping a ledger. I told her I already kept one. She looked at my freight book. "This is not a ledger. This is a confession written by a tired man." She was right. Her Spanish reading was limited, but numbers did not trouble her. I showed her the columns. She showed me where I had been losing money for 2 years by undercharging for barrel weight. It was the first time anyone had improved my business without also trying to own part of it. The danger came at dawn on the 17th of July. 8 riders, a deputy marshal, a district order. Sloan sat behind them on a bay horse and would not look at me. The deputy marshal was named Amos Vale. He was a heavy man in his 50s with a sunburned scalp and a voice that carried without effort. He read the order carefully. It directed him to remove Rosa and Inés from private property and return them to agency control. He sounded ashamed of the words, but he read everyone. I asked for 10 minutes. Vale gave me 20. Inside, Inés was furious, not frightened. Fury came first with her. She wanted the gelding saddled. She wanted the East Trail. She wanted the hills. Rosa said no. They will call it escape, she said. Then every door closes. I said I would go to Mescalero and challenge the order. Rosa looked at me for a long moment. You burned the paper. Yes. Now you must fight men who keep copies. Yes, you may lose, yes. Inés turned on me. Do not say you will come unless you will come. The room became very quiet. I said, I will come. She searched my face for whatever she had spent years learning to find in men. Then she nodded once. Outside, Vale allowed them to take blankets, food, and their own clothes. Sloan objected to the extra horse. Vale told him the order mentioned 2 women and said nothing about a horse. That was the first decent thing he did for us. Rosa mounted without help. Inés rode the black gelding she had found, and the animal danced beneath her as if anger had passed through the reins. They rode west. Inés looked back once. Rosa did not. I left for Mescalero before noon. Bell and Copper pulled the wagon 32 miles the first day and nearly killed themselves doing it. The second day, I left the wagon at a ranch and rode Mercy until she stumbled. The third morning I entered Mescalero with dust in my teeth, Pike's receipt in my pocket, and no idea what law could do for people whom law had turned into entries. The first attorney I spoke to asked for $100 before he would read the receipt. The second said I had no standing. The third told me quietly that Sloan's office supplied half the district and no judge would invite that trouble. By afternoon I had spent $3 on legal advice and learned only that cowardice can be itemized. Then a printer named Teresa Valdez read the receipt. Her newspaper occupied 2 rooms behind a mercantile store. The press shook the floor each time it came down. Teresa wore ink on both hands and had the unnerving habit of letting a person finish every word before deciding whether he had said anything worth hearing. I told her the story. She read Pike's receipt twice. Then she asked one question. Why does an agency clerk certify private debt labor? I said that is what I came to ask. She said, no, you came to recover 2 women. I am asking what he is hiding. That was the right question. She sent me to a lawyer named Benjamin Armitage, who worked above a coffin maker and charged $44 because he believed round numbers encouraged dishonesty. I had 26. Teresa loaned me 18 and made me sign a note at no interest. Paper can be used properly, she said. Armitage read the receipt. He read the removal order. He asked whether I had witnesses at Pike's Station. 6 drivers. Names 3. Find the others. For 2 days I found men. A freight driver named Tom Baird had seen Pike unlock the feed room. A teamster called Luis Ortega had heard Pike say the women came with the note. A mining supplier named Crowley denied remembering anything until Teresa told him the newspaper would print that he had been present. His memory improved. On the 3rd day, a young agency bookkeeper came to Teresa's office after dark. His name was Edwin Shaw. He was 23, thin as kindling, and terrified. He carried copied pages from Sloan's ration ledger. The pages listed Rosa and Inés as deceased, not absent, not transferred, deceased. Their names had been crossed out 8 months earlier, yet monthly rations continued to be claimed under a household total that still included them. Armitage placed the removal order beside the ledger copies. If they are dead, he said. They cannot be absent wards, Teresa said, and if they are alive, someone has been collecting provisions for ghosts. There it was, the hidden mechanism. Sloan had not come for Rosa and Inés because the government required their return. He came because living women could contradict profitable records. We filed for an emergency stay before District Judge Edwin Pell at 9 the next morning. Pell refused to hear us. Armitage asked again. Pell refused again. At noon, Teresa printed a special sheet. The headline did not accuse Sloan of trafficking. It asked why 2 women certified as dead had been seized alive under his authority. By 2 o'clock, copies were at the courthouse, the telegraph office, the army post, and 3 saloons. At 3, Judge Pell agreed to review the documents privately. At 4, Amos Vale arrived. He had ridden from the agency holding camp after seeing the newspaper sheet at the post. Vale closed the office door and told us Sloan planned to transfer Rosa and Inés north at dawn, beyond Pell's district. That was the darkest hour. Not because we had no evidence, because evidence moves at the speed of men, and wagons can leave before men decide to be brave. Armitage wrote the stay by hand. Pell signed it at 6 minutes past 5. Vale took the order and rode into a thunderstorm. I spent that night in Teresa's print room listening to the press. Each strike sounded like a door closing or opening, I could not tell which. At sunrise, no message had come. At 9, none. At noon, a telegraph arrived from the army post. Transfer stopped subsigseld pending hearing Vale. I sat down on a crate of paper because my knees had stopped being trustworthy. Teresa did not celebrate. She handed me coffee and said, "This is not release." She was right. It took 5 more days. Pike denied everything until 3 drivers testified. Sloan claimed the ledger copies were incomplete until Edwin Shaw produced the original book under subpoena. The ration columns were worse than the copies. Names of dead people. Names of people who had left. Children counted twice. Flour, coffee, and blankets billed to Washington and sold through private stations. Rosa and Inés were not the center of the fraud. They were 2 loose threads in a coat full of rot. Judge Pell suspended the removal order and ordered them released from agency custody while the territorial office investigated. He did not declare them free. He did not apologize. He simply wrote that no lawful basis for detention had been shown. Sometimes justice arrives dressed as a clerk correcting a mistake. You take it anyway. Sloan disappeared before the inquiry finished. Pike lost his supply contract that autumn and left the territory. The larger system remained. Systems rarely fall because one door opens. But that door opened. I rode to the holding camp with 2 spare horses. Rosa came out carrying the same blanket she had taken from Dry Cedar. Inés came behind her. She looked thinner. The bruise was gone. The watchfulness was not. Vale stood at the gate. He gave me the original removal order and said, "Keep it." I asked why. Because men misplace shame faster than paper. Then he walked away. On the first night of the ride home, we camped beneath a black ridge east of the river. No one spoke while the fire caught. Inés checked both horses, then checked them again. Rosa sat across from me. "You came," she said. "I said I would. That is why I say it." I waited. She looked toward the dark where Inés moved among the horses. "At Pike's Station you burned a paper that said what we were. I said nothing. In Mescalero you used paper to say what was true. Teresa did. Armitage did. Shaw did. Vale did. And you went to them. I went." Rosa picked up a charred stick and drew a line in the dirt. "Fire is not the opposite of paper," she said. "A lie can burn. A truth can burn. What matters is the hand." She placed the stick across the line. "The same hand can close a door or open it." I asked whether she and Inés still wanted to go north. Rosa said, "Inés will choose for herself. And you?" She looked at me with the calm expression she used when I had asked a question whose answer was already visible. "I am going to finish the water." We returned to Dry Cedar the next afternoon. The seep had overflowed its temporary stones and cut a shallow channel through the bank. Rosa stood over it with both hands on her hips. "You did this wrong," she said. I had not touched it. She was speaking to the water. That evening, Inés slept in the kitchen near the door. The next evening, farther from it. Within a month, she stopped placing a chair beneath the latch. That is how trust entered our house. Not as affection, as the removal of small defenses. The years that followed did not become gentle. They became ours. Rosa rebuilt the seep into a proper infiltration gallery with flat stone mesquite braces and a covered settling basin. By 1881, Dry Cedar held enough water to supply our household, 12 horses, 6 acres of beans and squash, and passing freight outfits at 2 cents a barrel. That 2 cents paid for roof timber. The roof timber protected the ledger. The ledger helped secure the land filing. The land filing kept Sloan's replacement from claiming the station sat on unassigned ground. That is how lives are built, not from one grand act, from one useful fact leaning against another. Rosa learned written Spanish first, then English. She learned because she refused to let paper surprise her again. At night she copied freight invoices beside the lamp. She would ask why one English word meant 3 different things, and I would explain badly. Then she would read the contract more accurately than I had. Once a cattle buyer tried to insert a penalty for unavailable water volume into a seasonal agreement. Rosa tapped the line with one finger. "He pays for access," she said, "not for rain." The buyer smiled at me as if I might overrule her. I told him, "You are negotiating with the person who found the water." He removed the clause. Inés became the finest horsewoman between the Sacramento Mountains and the Rio Grande, though she would have called that statement foolish because she had not met every horsewoman. She could tell which animal would panic from the way its ears rested before anyone mounted. She could turn a spoiled gelding useful without breaking the part that made it worth saving. She could also identify a liar within 3 sentences, which made her less patient with human beings than horses. In 1882, she began buying thin-range horses no one wanted, training them through winter, and selling them to freight contractors in spring. The first year she cleared $71, the second $136. By the fifth, she owned more stock than I did and reminded me of it whenever I offered advice. She married a blacksmith named Mateo Serrano. Mateo was born near Socorro to a Mexican father and a Pueblo mother. He spoke softly, worked iron beautifully, and understood that loving Inés did not mean standing in front of her. It meant standing where she had asked. They built a house 1 mile east of Dry Cedar, close enough that their children treated the distance as a long hallway. The oldest called me Tata Eli before anyone approved the title. The younger children followed. I protested for perhaps a year. Then I began carrying candy from Mescalero. Rosa never married again. Neither did I. People occasionally asked questions because people are often uncomfortable with a bond that does not fit a familiar drawer. Rosa and I shared land, work, danger, silence, money, arguments, meals, illness, and 40 years. Call it what you like, we did not need to. There was one winter when I nearly died. It was 1884. A fever took me after a freight run through sleet. For 3 days, I could not keep water down. On the 4th, I woke convinced I was back in Missouri and 17 years old. The room was dark. The stove had gone quiet. Then I heard paper turning. Rosa sat beside the lamp reading our land deed aloud. Not to me, to herself. Her English was careful and exact. She read the boundary description, the water clause, the recorded names, mine, hers, Inés's. All 3. When she saw I was awake, she closed the deed. I asked why she was reading it. To make sure it still says what it said yesterday. Does it? Yes, then let me sleep. She touched the back of her hand to my forehead. You are still foolish when sick. I am consistent. That is not the same thing. She stayed until morning. Years later, I asked what she had feared that night. She said that if you died, some man would arrive with a different paper. That answer explained more about our world than any speech could have. So we prepared. We registered the spring rights. We recorded shares. We drew wills. We kept copies in Mescalero, at the church, and in a metal box beneath Teresa's press. Paper had once been used to erase Rosa and Inés. Rosa spent the rest of her life making paper remember them. The moment I understood Dry Cedar had become home came in November of 1887. I had been gone 11 days delivering equipment to a copper prospect. The job paid well and went badly. Copper threw a shoe. Snow closed one pass. A foreman tried to reduce the agreed price because the barrels arrived 1 day late. By the time I reached the ridge west of the station, I was angry enough to argue with the moon. Then I saw a lamp in the west window. Just one square of amber. Below it, the dark line of the corral. Beyond it, smoke lifting from Rosa's kitchen chimney. Mercy raised her head in the yard and called. Something inside me settled, not softened, settled. Like a wagon load finding balance after miles of bad road. I had spent most of my life believing freedom meant no one could tell me where to stay. That night I understood another kind. Freedom can also mean there is one place you are no longer required to leave. Rosa was at the table when I entered. She looked at my face and said, "The foreman cheated you. How do you know? You only close the door that hard when someone has cheated you, or when Bell bites you. Bell is dead. Then someone cheated you." I put the contract on the table. She found the altered freight date within 30 seconds. We recovered the money in spring. Teresa Valdez remained our friend until she died in 1896. Her newspaper never became rich. It became useful, which is harder. Amos Vale came through twice. The first time he drank coffee and repaired a broken hinge without being asked. The second he brought Edwin Shaw, who had left agency work and become a county clerk. Shaw could barely look at Rosa. He apologized for having copied the ration sheets too late. Rosa told him, "Late is not the same as never," he cried after she left the room. Pike's receipt stayed in our metal box. So did the removal order. So did the special newspaper sheet asking how dead women had been seized alive. 3 papers, a sale, a seizure, a question. Rosa called them the ladder. One showed the hole, one showed the weight, one showed the way out. The worst trouble after that came from drought. In 1891, the rain failed so completely that cattle died standing in the shade. Our seep dropped by half. The bean field cracked. Freight outfits arrived with empty barrels and desperation in their faces. We could have charged 10 times the normal rate. Some stations did. Rosa refused. "We charge enough to keep the water," she said. "Not enough to own thirst. We rationed by animal count. We closed the horse training pasture. Inés moved part of her stock north. Mateo hauled stone to deepen the settling basin. For 7 months, dry cedar supplied an average of 38 gallons a day. 38. I remember because Rosa wrote the number every sunset. By October, we had helped keep more than 400 head of livestock moving through the corridor. No one got all the water they wanted. Most got enough to reach the next source. The drought broke in December. That year earned us less money than the year before. It earned us something more durable. After 1891, men stopped calling dry cedar Rourke's Station. They called it Rosa's Water. She pretended not to care. She cared. Inés's children grew. Mateo's hair went gray. My hands lost strength. Belle and Copper died years apart and were buried beneath the East Cottonwood. Mercy lived to 29 out of pure refusal. Dry cedar expanded from 3 rooms to 6. The west roof stopped leaking. The kitchen chimney never smoked again. Rosa and I continued to argue about the front step. I said it needed another stone. She said it needed a man who lifted his feet. I am 76 years old now. Rosa is near 70, though no record ever found the exact year of her birth. Inés is a grandmother. Mateo can no longer swing the heavy hammer every day, so one of his sons does the forging while he complains about the sound. The spring still runs, not as strong as it did in 1881. Strong enough. Rosa became ill last winter. The doctor from Mescalero says her heart is failing. He uses careful phrases because careful phrases make helplessness sound professional. Rosa listens, thanks him, and then asks whether the doctor noticed the west wall has shifted half an inch. He never does. She does. Most evenings she sits near the stove with the ledgers. She does not need to work. She says numbers become lonely if ignored. Last week she asked me to bring the metal box. I set it on the table. She took out Pike's receipt. The paper is yellow now. The ink has browned. Orrin Pike's name is still sharp. Received from Elias Rook, $11 for transfer of note and associated claim. That was how he described 2 women. Rosa read it and smiled without humor. He wrote too much, she said. How? He admitted the claim was associated with the note. When the note burned, the claim had nothing to stand on. Armitage said something similar. Armitage used more words. He charged by the word. She folded the receipt. Then she asked for the saddle. The old saddle hangs in the storeroom. The left skirt still carries the rawhide patch I cut open at Pike's Station. I never repaired it properly. I stitched it back with dart thread, but the seam is uneven and the leather puckers. I brought it to the kitchen. Rosa ran her fingers along the patch. Your father hid the money here? Yes. What did he say? He said to keep one thing where greed could not find it. She thought about that. Then she said greed found the money. It did, but it did not keep it. No, it did not. That evening Inés came with Mateo and 3 grandchildren. The children filled the kitchen with noise. One argued about a saddle strap. Another stole dried apples. Mateo fell asleep in a chair before supper. Rosa sat at the head of the table because everyone had stopped pretending any other seat belonged to her. At some point, the youngest child asked why the old saddle was in the kitchen. Inés told the story. Not the way I tell it. Her way. In her version, I looked frightened at Pike's Station. I objected. She said I was frightened. Rosa said he was. I asked whether anyone in the room remembered loyalty. No one did. Inés described the sound of the seal curling in the stove. She described the smell of burned paper. She described watching the numbers vanish before the names. Then she said something I had never heard. I did not trust him when he opened the door, she told the children. I trusted the fire first. The room quieted. She looked at me. The fire could not pretend. I wanted to answer. Nothing came. Rosa reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her hand is lighter now. The joints are swollen. The strength in it is not what it was, but I knew that hand. It had found water under salt grass. It had turned a failing station into land that could carry families. It had learned every dangerous edge of English. It had signed deeds, corrected buyers, measured drought, held fever water, and pointed out walls before they fell. There are lives as you can count in years. There are lives better counted in things that did not collapse. The west roof, the spring bank, the land filing, Inés's trust. My own poor understanding of what a home was. Rosa squeezed my hand once. You thought you bought the right to burn a paper, she said. I did. No, you bought a question. What question? She looked around the kitchen, at Inés, at Mateo, at the grandchildren, at the ledgers stacked beside the lamp. What can people build after the lie is gone? I have been answering that question for 40 years. We built 6 rooms from 3. We built a water business from a seep that fit inside a cup. We built horse lines that still carry Inés's eye and patience. We built records no clerk could quietly erase. We built a place where children walked through the door without asking permission. And we built something the paper at Pike Station had no word for. Not ownership, not debt, not charity. Belonging chosen again and again until choice became structure. The $11 were real. So was the fear. So were the rides, the court fees, the ink, the drought, and the years. But the most expensive thing I spent was the belief that a man can remain untouched by doing what is right. You cannot. The right act changes your road. Sometimes it changes the people beside you. Sometimes, if you are fortunate, it changes where the road ends. Rosa is asleep in the next room now. Inés left an hour ago after checking the horses twice. The saddle is still beside my chair. The patch hangs open slightly where the thread has weakened. There is nothing hidden beneath it anymore. No silver, no note, no reserve. Only the empty space where $11 waited 14 years for the moment they were meant to be spent. I used to think my father taught me how to protect something from the world. Now I think he taught me to keep one part of myself ready for the day the world demanded a price. The contract burned in less than a minute. The home it made took the rest of our lives.